Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's event on the National Technology and Industrial Base Integration, How to Overcome Barriers and Capitalize on Cooperation. And we have a dual purpose this morning. One purpose is to tell you about our new report coming out today, which was an ongoing project that I'll describe in a little greater detail in a minute. And the second is to hear from this really august panel that we've assembled of the 4 partner nations on the National Technology Industrial Base and have a discussion about what are the opportunities and the things that we need to do to really leverage this approach to allied cooperation. And so again, I want to welcome you to our event this morning and let you know that like all CSIS events, we have a security plan in place, which we don't expect to have to use, but if anything were to happen that would cause us to need to leave this room and or the building, I'll be your security officer and will give you directions about where to go, which would either be out the way you came in or out the back, if depending on why we would need to vacate. But we don't anticipate that. I want to also make sure that I give thanks to 2 organizations because they supported the work that we're going to talk to you about this morning in the CSIS report. The first is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom, which supported much of the work that we'll be talking about this morning and today's event. And then secondly, also the Government of Australia, which supported a workshop on other transaction authority agreements that we have included work from in our report, and that I'll also address this morning. So I want to thank the support from those organizations. I'm going to talk first about the report and give you a sense of what we did and what we think is important about it, and then I'll turn to the panel. So I think it will not shock anyone in this room or anyone watching us online that we think one of the primary pillars of U.S. national security is a robust, innovative, and resilient industrial base that supports the U.S. military with cutting-edge capabilities. And that's been a key U.S. advantage that the U.S. military has had for decades, and a central to U.S. strategy to take advantage of U.S. industry in this way. And the largely private nature of the U.S. defense industrial base has allowed the Department of Defense to leverage the broader American economy. But an important point, I think, about that is that the American economy is inherently linked to the global economy. We have an open economy, and that means we trade mostly freely with other nations, and that's true in defense trade as well as in other areas of trade. Defense trade is a little bit of a special case. Things are maybe not as open, or they're definitely not as open and free in defense trade as they are in other sectors of trade, but nonetheless it is an open system. And that has been a source of advantage to the U.S. military as well, the ability to leverage industrial capabilities of partner and allied nations, and also to support the capabilities of partner and allied nations through defense trade. In 1992, at the end of the Cold War, the Congress was concerned that the industrial base was really potentially in for some tough times. In fact, they knew that the industrial base was in for some tough times at the end of the Cold War. And so they put up a requirement to the Department of Defense that it study and report annually on the state of the industrial base to ensure that they take the steps necessary to foster and safeguard what was described in statute as the National Technology and Industrial Base. And Jerry defends and does that today, and is, in fact, deep in the process of an aggressive effort on that as we sit here. And from the beginning, this term, the National Technology Industrial Base, included entities outside U.S. borders. So this is a long-standing understanding in the U.S. that the industrial base the Department of Defense relies on is an international one. And of course, in the early years, this was especially true with respect to Canada, where we have had a defense relationship of 70 years duration that includes tight cooperation on defense industrial issues. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, we have a great report on that we released last year that you should definitely read. And this work definitely follows on to that. The other point that I would make about the understanding within the U.S. system that defense industrial base is an international one is the fact that we have in this country domestic source requirements in law and in regulation that are fairly well known. But almost all of them, the vast majority of them, include exceptions that recognize that the global supply chain is global. that there's international content, there's foreign content in U.S. produced goods, and statutes like the Buy America Act recognize that. And there are goods that the U.S. military relies upon that are only available overseas. And so you see in the Buy America Act a domestic non-availability exception to get material that only comes from outside the United States. And you also see that we accord special treatment to our reciprocal trade partners who have agreed to provide us with access to their markets in return for which we provide them access to the U.S. market. And I think you see some of these issues even today in the debate that we're having over steel and aluminum tariffs. These issues return and are important again. So I think the Congress took a very big step in the Defense Authorization Act by expanding the national technology industrial base as defined in statute to include the United Kingdom and Australia in the 2017 Defense Authorization Bill. And this, I think, is in accordance with an understanding of the changing strategic environment that is affecting the defense industry. And that's highlighted in the recently released National Defense Strategy, where it talks about, and I quote, "The new commercial technology will change society and ultimately the character of war, and that the department's technological advantage depends on a healthy and secure national security innovation base that includes both traditional and non-traditional defense partners." And so the strategy recognizes the increasingly global nature of national security relevant technology and is focused on getting access to it wherever it comes from. And Jerry's boss, Eric Tuning, when he was here in January, made reference to this and to the NTIB in particular. The other thing that Congress did was to task the U.S. Department of Defense, because that's who they can task directly, to look at ways to further seamlessly integrate the national technology industrial base. I think maybe it's true to say, although maybe slightly impolitic, that the tasking has included our partners who have, I think, willingly joined in the task of doing this, but obviously the Congress can't task them directly, so we're glad that they voluntarily agreed to participate. And CSIS undertook a project to try and figure out what this might mean, to talk to, it's not so much that we are going to figure it out, but we tried to talk to experts in the field, from industry, from the partner nations, and in the policy community to think about ways that we could more seamlessly integrate the national technology industrial base. So we had 4 workshops over the course of the project. We had a workshop focused, as I said, specifically on other transaction agreement authorities, and 2 workshops focused on case studies, one on performance-based logistics and one on open systems architecture as avenues, possible avenues that the NTIB could explore for tighter integration and deeper cooperation. But we really started the project looking at strategic objectives. What does NTIB integration deliver? What can it deliver to the allies? And there was a consensus in the workshop that we had that focused on this, that NTIB integration has the potential to foster shared objectives of encouraging innovation, leveraging commercial technology for military purposes, advancing key technologies needed for common security challenges in Europe and Asia, making the industrial base more resilient to shocks and able to deliver capabilities at lower cost, and facilitating allied interoperability. So it strikes me that's a lot, there's a lot of goodness in those objectives if we can find a way to deepen our cooperation to get there. And I mentioned we looked at other transaction authority agreements. That's obviously tied very much to this issue of innovation, how to get more innovative in terms of the technologies we're able to realize, how quickly we can get them, and our business arrangements for accessing technology. And the discussion in that workshop found that OTAs, as well as other more traditional tools like cooperative research agreements, have a lot of potential to help the NTIB partners work collaboratively with each other and with key players in industry to advance critical technologies, especially in areas where there's significant congruence between military and commercial applications. And we did find that we felt there were opportunities to use those agreements in ways that crossed international boundaries to facilitate true industrial integration in a way that we haven't traditionally used them in the past, although there are a few examples we found of international OTAs that did seem to have some success. So we think there's precedent for that. Our performance-based logistics case study, we undertook this case study because it struck us that we know that the 4 partner nations all operate a lot of the same equipment. And it's also true, in fact, there's a handful that are literally operated by all 4 partners. And there's a much larger body that are operated by 2 or 3 of the partner nations. And then we also know that all 4 nations look to PBL as a way to support some of those platforms. And in some cases, we look specifically a little bit, just for illustrative purposes, to Chinook helicopter. All 4 partner nations operate the platform, and all 4 partner nations have some degree of PBL associated with the platform. So we wanted to take a look and see what would it mean, or what might it mean to try and use PBL as a way to deepen NTIB integration. And what we found was, I think, kind of interesting. It was maybe a little more complex than I first thought when we started to look into it, because as I said, it seems so logical, same platform, people using PBL across the board. How hard could it be to link these up? But it turns out it is a little complicated because there are quite a few variations among nations about why PBL is their, if it is their preferred tool of choice for sustainment, why it is their preferred tool of sustainment, what the objectives that they focus on most when they put together contract incentives in a performance-based logistics agreement are, what they're measuring and what they're looking for in terms of outcomes. And also, particularly true in the American case, there's a difference in the length and duration of these contracts. So in the US case, the contracts are usually 5 years, possibly with options for slightly longer, but in many of our international partners engage in much longer time frame agreements. So there's quite a bit of diversity in the way that NTIB partners go about PBL. On the other hand, we also thought there was a lot of opportunities, not necessarily to establish a single NTIB PBL agreement, but for the partners to coordinate in the way they approach sustainment of these platforms, both using PBL and using other tools that are not PBL on the logistics end, including information sharing and harmonizing of possibly of incentives and contract milestones. In the case of open systems, again, it seemed logical to us like this would be a really important tool for the NTIB to use, because the whole point of open systems architecture is that you want to create the ability for industry partners from a wide variety of places within industry or internationally to work together. And you want, even if they're not used to working together, so they don't have established relationships. And secondly, you want to use open systems architecture to lower the cost and complexity of integrating technology from diverse suppliers. And so that seemed like a tool that would lend itself extremely well to this problem set of how to better integrate the industrial base across the NTIB partner nations. We think that's true, but again, we discovered that there is complexity here. There is complexity because there's, I think, different degrees of commitment, an overarching commitment to open systems among the nations, although they're all certainly working on it and exploring it. There's also, to some extent, the different nations have different approaches to developing national standards. I say different approaches in the sense of the way they think about what it means to do open systems architecture and what kind of standards that they've been developing within their systems, and also differences in terms of how they think of open systems working in development. So there's different approaches. You can have a charitable foundation be the controller of an open standard. Maybe the government starts out as the instigator, and then it transitions to a third-party organization. In some cases, it could be that a contractor is hired to be the custodian of the open standard and share it with other partners, and different arrangements as to who owns the intellectual property then of the standard. None of these, by the way, we think are killers, things that would make it impossible for the partners to cooperate. But there's plenty of diversity in the way that it's done. So again, we didn't necessarily find that it would be easy to simply come out and say there's going to be a single NTIB standard for aircraft, a single NTIB standard for vehicles, a single NTIB standard for message traffic, although it gets closer when you get into message traffic issues. But we did see there was a lot of opportunity to share information about the standards, to think from the beginning about how to integrate and coordinate standards, how it might be easy to kind of put a wrapper around a product from one country so that it can log into an open system standard developed by another country. And again, to harmonize approaches. And we think there's a lot of value, potential value in that. One other thing that obviously was kind of a no-brainer, I think, we knew going in was true, but was brought forward very forcefully, is the critical role that technology controls, particularly US technology controls, the ITAR, plays in this whole relationship. It comes up at every turn, in every conversation. To give you one example, we found, for example, with open systems architecture, that sometimes the open standard is classified and cannot be shared with an international partner. So I struggled at first to put my mind around the idea of an open standard that is classified and therefore inherently closed in an important way, hard to share internationally. But you know, I'm not going to prejudge that anyone who's made that decision did it wrongly. They had a lot of information upon which to make that decision. But we do think it's critical that the ITAR, with respect to the NTIB, take account of the needs of this partnership for more openness. And the 70-year relationship with Canada has really provided a good model of how that can be done. With the ITAR exemption that Canada has, and they have engaged in a lot of work on their side to make sure that they have controls in place that is complementary to the ITAR system. And we think there's opportunity, and I'm transitioning now briefly to our recommendations, to develop ITAR exemption for the NTIB, either for the partners individually or for possibly I can envision an NTIB exemption that applies to all the NTIB partners. I think the Canadian exemption would stay in place because it's operating well, and I don't see a need to take away something that works. But I think there is possibility to add to the ITAR exemptions for NTIB purposes. Open systems might be an example. I think there's plenty of other opportunities there for ITAR to be tailored to the way that the NTIB can work. And I think one of our other major findings is on, just before I leave the topic of ITAR, we also looked at program licensing. That seems like a really good opportunity for the NTIB in particular, although it would undoubtedly extend beyond the NTIB partner nations. But it has, we think, a lot of opportunity to particularly help cross-border firms that are operating internationally and offering the same systems internationally, and the NTIB partners. These kinds of firms, and many of them are the big defense firms we know and love, operate in all four NTIB partner nations, and their operations could be made much simpler if there was a program licensing approach adopted. And the second, or the next recommendation that I want to hit on is on the acquisition workforce. One of the clear takeaways from all of our deep dives on the two case studies and other transaction authority agreements is that there's a lot of work to be done to get the acquisition workforce in a place where it's going to be able to implement these kinds of approaches well. And that, I think, is true across all the partner nations. And it struck us that there's an opportunity here potentially to do some kind of common acquisition workforce training across the NTIB. And I think there's going to have to be obviously specialized aspects to that because, as I already said, there's a lot of diversity in the way the nations implement these. But in terms of the basic principles, I think there's a lot that could be done in common. And I think having the acquisition workforce members actually taking training with partners from international nations might be the most powerful way we can communicate to the workforce that, you know, this NTIB matters. These partner nations are people you should be expecting to be working with throughout your career. So that's our report. It's about 60 pages, so it's not too long of a read by the standards of the CSIS DIG program. And I hope you'll dig further into it. There's a lot more there. And so at this point, I'm going to pause on my lecture and engage the panel for the panel discussion. And let me just first briefly introduce them so that you know who you're going to be hearing from. To my left, we have Jerry McGinn, Dr. Jerry McGinn. Sorry, I don't mean to not include the doctorate which you've earned. He's Principal Deputy Director for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. Now, I guess would be what I should say. And he's responsible for analyzing the capabilities in the industrial base, as I mentioned, the overall health, and developing recommendations on the policies concerning the industrial base. He has a background in the U.S. Army as an Army officer. He was Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at Kinetic North America and has experience in several positions in industry that has brought him to this position. To his left is Mr. Simon Gadd, who's Counselor for Defense Acquisition and Technology for the British Defence Staff. And he's previously served in a variety of positions in the UK Ministry of Defence, including Head of Projects for the Defence Infrastructure Organization, as a Principal Engineer to the Director for Land Equipment, and a Team Leader for Logistics and Support Vehicle Program Support. To his left, Roger Gross, who is Counselor Defence Materiel for the Department of Defence of Australia, also a former Army officer in the Australian Defence Force, and he has served previously as an Operations Analyst, as Assistant Secretary of Critical Systems for the Joint Systems Division and Director of the Systems Program Office that was delivering a command and control system for the Australian Army. And to his left is Ghislaine Chaput, First Secretary of Defence Trade Policy for the Embassy of Canada. He's previously served a range of positions in the Canadian Foreign Service, Senior Policy Advisor for U.S. Relations, Head of Public Affairs for the High Commission of Canada and India. Well, I'm going to actually give each panelist an opportunity to talk for about 5 minutes on their views of the NTIB. If they want to give us constructive feedback on our report, we welcome that as well. And Jerry, we'll start with you.
Great. All right. Well, thanks very much, Andrew. And it's great to be here with my colleagues from the NTIB partner countries. And it's great to be here at CSIS with you. I read with interest the report that you all are releasing today, and it was great work done by you and your colleagues Reese and Greg, and was it Megan, I think?
Well, there was a few. Samantha.
Yeah, Samantha.
Yes.
The team that did it. And I really applaud the effort focusing on on practical ways on taking the look at open systems architectures and performance-based logistics to see practically how we could make some advancements using the NTIB framework. So I think that's tremendous. What I'll start out with is talk a little bit about the department. The Secretary Mattis has outlined in the National Defense Strategy 3 principal lines of effort or priorities. Those are to build a more lethal force, to strengthen our relationships with partners and allies, and to reform business practices in the department. And on the face of it, NTIB would seem to fall very clearly in the middle bucket around partners and allies, and it does. But it also has implications for the lethality of our force as well as for business practices, which I'll touch on. So as Andrew mentioned, the NTIB has been around. It's been a partnership between the U.S. and Canada for many years. And in 2017, that was extended to include the UK and Australia. And the language directed us to develop an implementation plan for what that means. And that's what we've focused on during 2017. And it's a really great opportunity to increase the procurement efficiencies, boost interoperability, and spur innovation. As Secretary Mattis points out, nations with strong allies thrive, those without them decline. It's never more true than in combat operations. And so we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of U.S.-Australian mateship, for instance. So we see, and then we have tremendous cooperation there. And we had Canada help with the MRAPs during during the Iraq and Afghanistan kind of conflict. The Australian, there's designs involved in the LCS ship that are very pivotal to that capability. And then the Brits and the Aussies have soldiers and officers serving in our combatant commands and CENTCOM and the like, operating on our SIPRNet, our classified network. So there's a close, long-standing relationship on the operational level and beyond with these countries. And NTIB gives us an opportunity to build off that. So these common systems and supply chains, they incentivize an alignment of standards and capabilities that support interoperability. And Andrew outlined some of the ways you can do that, through PBL, OTAs, and the like. So what are we doing? So my office is the lead for this in DoD. As I mentioned, the Congress gave us clear direction, and we've been working on a regular basis, meeting monthly with our NTIB partners, and then internally even more so to develop an implementation plan. We completed that plan, and Eric and I presented it to Ms. Lord, the Undersecretary for Acquisition, as a statement recently, and she approved it. So we're moving out smartly. You'll see the congressional requirement was to report on it in the annual industrial capabilities report. So you'll see that in that report, which, as Andrew mentioned, is being finalized right now. Eric and I are finalizing before we submit it to Ms. Lord this month. One of the things that we did back last summer was the NTIB principles. So that is, at the time I was the acting TASD, now it's Eric, and colleagues from the NTIB partner countries got together and said, okay, what do we want this NTIB to be? And what we thought is, instead of, again, like you allude to in the paper, we don't want to do a boil the ocean approach. We want to take, what are some practical things that we can do to really kind of move the ball and define this space. So we agreed at that meeting in August to launch four what we call Pathfinders, Pathfinder projects. One was to do a sort of a general statement of principles and to agree to this is what the governments align on the goals of the NTIB, and that has been, I believe, signed. Has Hugh signed it as well? Okay, so that has been signed by all the principals recently, and then so that's the first. The other three are focused around areas of collaboration. One is on building off the common goods program, the control goods program, excuse me, the ITAR exemption with Canada, looking at that and seeing if there are models where we could do something for the other NTIB partners along these lines. So, and then the second is around the area of foreign investment or investment security. That is, there's been, we have the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. The other NTIB partners have different regimes for looking at how, looking at the national security implications of transactions occurring in our countries. But there's a real need to share best practices on this because it is a global industrial base, and transactions in our countries have impacts on, have impacts throughout the global supply chain. So that's one Pathfinder area. And the third is around cybersecurity for small and medium-sized enterprises. And that is, and so the Australians are co-leading that with us. The Canadians are doing the controlled goods with us, and then the Brits are doing the investment security. And so we're finalizing the terms of reference for those Pathfinders to guide their work in the coming months. So we're excited about those. And so how do we define success? I mean, success in our perspective, is an integrated and active NTIB where the best products and most innovative systems come from our member countries, whether it's Melbourne, Australia, or Melbourne, Florida, London, Ontario, or London in the United Kingdom. So that would be success in our view. So we recognize the implementation of this is not going to be without challenges, and I think your work kind of showed that. I mean, it's great to talk principles, but how to do it can get thorny at times. But we're grateful to be partners with our with the countries on this stage on this effort, and we're excited about the effort we've begun. So, Simon.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to extend my thanks to Andrew and the CSIS team as well, and to everybody else for taking time to be here today. And it's again a great pleasure to be on the stage here with the partners from the NTIB nations. I'm probably going to talk more about principles and detail. We see great opportunity in the national technology and industrial base to help deliver the benefits of collaboration and cooperation amongst close allies. Congress's decision in NDAA 17 to expand the NTIB is a clear acknowledgement that the partners represented here today face the same threats and challenges. We share common interests and ambitions, and that no single country really has a monopoly on good ideas, STEM talent and innovation. And we all need to look beyond our borders and work collectively to respond to the shared threats that we face at the moment. This has already been mentioned, that this is sort of echoed in the National Security Strategy that's recently been published, which highlights the importance of allies by putting emphasis on the need to nurture a healthy innovation economy that collaborates with allies and partners. Improved STEM education draws on an advanced technical workforce and invests in early stage research and development. The strategy recognises that protecting the national security innovation base requires a domestic and international response, and this demonstrates the importance of allies in creating a strong allied industrial base which serves all of the needs and ensures security of supply amongst NTIB partners. The UK's 2015 Strategic Defence and Security Review, which is one of the primary statements of UK defence and security policy, emphasises the concept of international by design, and the UK has always worked with allies and partners, and SDSR 15 committed us to increase this engagement in areas that include capability collaboration with key allies. The Ministry of Defence's recent Defence Industrial Policy refresh, which sets out how the government will engage with industry to deliver national security needs, underscores our commitment to be international by design, recognising that the UK derives mutual benefit from working with allies and international partners to develop military capability for our armed forces. These benefits include improved interoperability, which has been mentioned already, between armed forces, access to industrial and technology expertise, and reductions in the cost of capability development and service support. And this sort of idea of trying to do things more efficiently and effectively is something that comes out a lot in the approach the report took. The M&A also encourages UK industry to strengthen partnerships and collaboration with industry from allied nations throughout the supply chain. And it's a fact of life that our industries are very closely integrated, not only between the UK and US, but with Canada and Australia as well. So from an industry perspective, seamlessly integrating the unique components of our shared technology and industrial base, traditional defence contractors, commercial and non-traditional industries, and academia, enables companies to share ideas, knowledge and technology and work together to transform discovery into capability that underpins our collective security. An integrated national technology and industrial base also enables partners, nations, to leverage the unique strengths and capabilities of our partners and to serve as a guarantor of critical capability in times of need. Senate report in NDA 18, the committee wrote that the integrated NTIB would contribute significantly to successful development, production and fielding of the highest quality systems at the most reasonable costs, which would ensure warfighters from all NTIB partner nations maintain the technological edge and on the battlefield. So I think there's some very clear statements that recognise the importance of our close industry collaboration in delivering what is really important, which is the capability that our warfighters need to do their job. We're very grateful to be engaged by Jerry and his team and to be working with our partners on this initiative. And we look forward to continuing that partnership and hope that NTIB will deliver some really valuable outcomes on behalf of everybody.
All right, so I just would echo the thanks for the opportunity to share the stage here on CSIS. So it's first for me, and it's a real honour. So thank you. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of Australia's industry policy. There's a lot going on at the moment, so I'll be brief, and I'll just draw out how that relates to the NTIB. But I think it's first we'd like to say that Australia was honoured to be included in the NTIB by the US Congress. So thank you. So our view is that the multilateral industrial-based groupings such as the NTIB, they meaningfully contribute to the credibility and effectiveness of US alliances. It's a significant development for our alliance and our ability to work together with the US to develop advanced capabilities. So we think it has the potential to enhance industrial and technological cooperation and expand the mutual pool of innovation available to maintaining advantage. So our recent defence white papers and foreign policy white papers, which were released by Minister for Defence and Prime Minister respectively, reinforce the importance of our treaty-based alliances with the US in completely unambiguous terms. And it's just worth reflecting that working in alliances and coalitions is normal for Australia. So since we became a country in 1901, at that moment we were deployed with the UK in Africa in the Boer War as part of a UK-led task force. And then in World War I, as Jerry briefly mentioned, on 4th of July 1918 was the first time that Australian and US forces served alongside one another, and that's been the case in every major conflict since. So from these earlier times and up to today, our government has deployed military forces as part of coalitions, normally far from home, and in recent decades under US leadership. So our view is that the countries within the NTIB, and especially Australia, are the closest possible national security allies and genuine partners to the US. So a few general trade comments, because I know that's topical. So fair and reciprocal trade and investment, they're always going to be Australian priorities. We will always support market-based economics based on free trade principles underpinned by sound economic governance. So the 2-to-1 US trade surplus with Australia is one of the largest with any partner at over $27 billion in 2016. And the US is for Australia the largest source and destination of foreign direct investment, and 100% of US exports enter into Australia tariff-free. So trade has been central to the national prosperity of our countries, and the Indo-Pacific, being Australia's home, will be the engine room of future global economic prosperity if based on leadership for free markets and a rule-based order. So returning to defence, the government is committed to raising our defence expenditure to 2% of GDP by 21-22. And so to deliver this, we're planning our defence industry in a way that we haven't done before. So historically, our contribution to the US has been in the mid-tier of the supply chains to US defence primes. And it's worth noting that all the big primes in Australia are generally subsidiaries of US primes. And while those companies employ about half of the 30,000 directly employed in the defence sector in Australia, 90% of the companies are small to medium enterprises. And so they're the ones that contribute into the mid-tier. So we've chosen not to have an offset program for those small companies to try and encourage them to be globally competitive on their own terms, although we do have an Australian industry capability program to encourage their involvement. So exports haven't historically been a priority for Australia, but we view them as an essential part of our vision for a sustainable and internationally competitive defence sector. So given the small size of our industrial base compared to the US, companies that export are more likely to be successful to overcome fluctuations in work, and they tend to be exporting companies around the world generally generate more employment and build better products. And, so I'm just holding a copy here. So our government released an export strategy in January this year to try and pull together all the threads. So exports to the NTIB partners represented here, plus New Zealand, are critical to this strategy. So historically, they've made up 50% of everything we've exported from Australia in defence-related exports. So innovation is I know each speaker will mention that, but we are doing what we can to encourage innovation as part of our defence industry policy approach, and we're investing heavily through 2 new funds, the Innovation Hub and the Next Gen Technology Fund. So they're designed to strengthen the contribution that our industry is able to make to the supply chains of our NTIB partners and contribute to reducing market barriers. So the NTIB provides just yet a further mechanism for the US and partners to access innovation and niche capabilities from within our defence industry. So we mentioned the Pathfinder, which is on cybersecurity. So given that we have so many small to medium enterprises who often have limited resources and ICT infrastructure to address cybersecurity challenges. That's the focus, is helping that community. So we're doing it in close cooperation with AustCyber, which is our national cybersecurity growth network, and that brings together subject matter experts to, it's a government-owned enterprise to help our business comply. So the Pathfinder is focused on controlled unclassified information, which is the type of information given to our SMEs most frequently. And many of you would be aware that DFARS now requires that companies handling that sort of information comply with the NIST 800-171 standard. So it's assisting companies comply with that standard is the first challenge. So there's future policy going to be released this year. I mentioned there was a lot going on in industry policy, more than I can recall in recent decades. There will be a Defence Industrial Capability Plan that will lay out the industrial capability priorities and a 10-year plan for growing our defence industry, and also a defence industry skilling strategy to match demand for defence industry capability with the right mix of workforce and skills. So in conclusion, we think industrial capability is the force behind the Defence Force, and we stand ready to help meet and address niche gaps that are identified by the US within the NTIB. And we're making our own investments to strengthen our defence industry, which will in turn enable us to be a strong and more capable partner. And together we can effectively meet a far wider range of security challenges than any one of us could do alone.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I also want to thank you, Andrew, for your work on this, and also the Canadian studies. So essentially, we've been working together for over 18 months on these two projects, and I just want to say for people in the room that if there's a purely bilateral Canada-US study, it's not because we wanted to do a band apart. It's because essentially that idea of a quadrilateral NTIB was not around when we started the work, and by the time it popped up in the NDAA, your work was really advanced. So, but I'm glad to see that you're actually using that study in your further reports, and as a group, we're also looking at some of the recommendations you had put there to see if there might be a quadrilateral application. And I guess there's people here in the room that have also, so I have a perfect record. I did all of the workshops, the Canadian workshops, and the quadrilateral workshops. And frankly, I'm not a D&D person. I'm a Global Affairs Canada person. So I've learned more than I thought I would. I often make jokes that I was posted to India, and by the time I left, I knew less than when I arrived. And I feel that defense industrial base cooperation is a little bit in the same. Every time you open a new door, there's 4 more doors, and So anyway, the depth of your knowledge, Andrew, has certainly helped get me up to speed. So I had been given a heads up that I would speak less, so I will speak less, but that I would speak last. So I think everyone's already made the case for why NTIB cooperation makes sense. So I'll just try to add a few things that may not have been mentioned. First, for your audience, I think it's really important to because you did mention that this flows from NDA directive to the Secretary of Defense, but also the NTIB is a purely U.S. construct. It's an article in U.S. law, and so we're all working on this, but eventually I think the end product will be much better if we, once that kind of U.S.-centric part is well on track, and we start looking at all, the other sets of bilateral relationships and how it works, how we can, further that seamless integration as well. I guess you all talked about this. Multilateral cooperation is hard, and you need to make sure there's that the price at the end is the prize is commensurate with the effort that we put in this. So anyway, I think we all agree that NTIB is not like a magic sauce that can be applied to every recipe, and that there will be a need to keep strong bilateral relationships in this area between all the countries, so that when sometimes our priorities don't align, sometimes it's just the timing doesn't work, so that some of these things that are already in the pipeline maybe we can keep working on. One of your conclusions in the report, I did read it up to the conclusions, is that it will take a senior leadership effort at some point to really push this. And I think it's important to look at everything else that is going on currently, like just in that area. National security innovation base, how will that impact what we're doing? Section 809 panel, they issued their first report and recommendations. There's 2 more coming in the next 12 months. I think MIBP has done a lot of work already, maybe all of its work on that supply chain resiliency report, so that what comes out of there will also have an impact. And then there's always the next NDA, and there will be new provisions that deal with industrial-based matters. So anyway, I think that's it for me. I really look forward to our discussions.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to start by talking a little bit about how to grapple with this problem. So it's like something everyone on this stage has wrestled with a problem as big as integrating the industrial base of 4 sovereign nations. How do you tackle a problem like that? Now, there is some good news. I think the phrase you used, Jerry, was how do you how do you do it without trying to boil the ocean? Mm-hmm. And there is good news, I would say. One of which is, to some extent, they're already integrated. There's a natural integration that has developed over time. So there's quite a bit of supply chain integration that's already occurring under existing parameters. The second piece is that we have history to fall back on, or at least to try and learn from. I mentioned the 70 years of NTIB between the U.S. and Canada, and then there's these prior defense trade treaties with the UK and the US and with Australia and the US. And so I guess I would start with the panel on what do you think the big lessons from this historical experience we've had? The fact that supply chains seem to naturally integrate to some extent on their own because they have done so. And then just the tradition or the history of the intergovernmental relations that we see in defense trade. What are the big lessons for how we can do what the Congress has directed, try to deepen integration from that history that you draw? And anyone on the panel who would like to start?
I'm happy to make a couple of comments. I think it's interesting you make reference to lessons learned, or if you want, experience of the past. And in particular, I think you make reference in the report to things like Defence Trade Cooperation Treaty that exists between the US and UK and US and Australia. And certainly from the UK's experience, that whilst it's a very welcome treaty, it's for UK industry, it's not proved to be attractive for whatever reason. So I think going back to your point about the fact that our industries tend to sort of integrate anyway. There's a it's a global environment for industry, and most of the major players in defence exist on both sides of the Atlantic and in Australia and in Canada as well. Listening to industry is probably quite important in terms of, so what are the barriers you come across, what are the challenges you face, and how could therefore maybe we adjust things or change things slightly to make life a bit easier. It is a big elephant now, so perhaps it's about doing small pieces, little elements and minor changes, rather than trying to create a big package which then you implement only maybe to find that actually doesn't have the consequences you'd intended in terms of outcomes. So I think engagement with the industry is important, and chewing the elephant in small bites.
Sure, I'd echo that sentiment of reinforcing success where you find it. The free flow of goods and services, parts, components, information, tech data within supply chains that are already pre-contemplated for capabilities that we buy from each other. I mean, that would be a great place to see some improvements.
Is that a reference to program licensing, or are you speaking more broadly?
Well, program licensing is a potential solution. There's changes that one could make to the ITAR that could alleviate friction in the supply chain, but it's finding bite-sized bits to work on, and where you've had success, you reinforce that success. That's a general lesson. In terms of cooperation, Australia's chosen to be part of a number of cooperative programs with the United States, and so we get a lot of benefit from that. And so the JSF obviously is the most prominent of those, but there's also the P8, the Maritime Patrol Aircraft, and facilitating the governance of cooperative programs is something that we're actively interested in.
Just briefly, I think like this whole process, the formal process, but also like your research and that being done by others right now, it's really like in terms of identifying the barriers. There are barriers like no one knew existed, right? Sometimes they take place like at the working level, and people like figure out a way, and they don't necessarily like make it a priority to tell their governments, that this is, and so, there's already a lot of good. The list of things we need to look at is getting, bigger by the day. In terms of experience from the bilateral point of view, I guess you can't be in too much of a rush. So it took us 70 years bilaterally to get where we are, and as we're seeing now, it's something that's still perfectible, right? It's not like we worked on it and things change, right? So 70 years ago, there's many things like no one was thinking about cybersecurity for sure. So there's always going to be, new things that we need to look at, and then I guess a general lesson is, simplicity is probably something you want to find, because like we're really lucky that we have the Defense Production Sharing Agreement. It's been around for over 60 years. It's remarkably simple, and it held, so it still works today. So.
The only thing I would add is, as you stated, this is already happening among companies. I mean, there are so many, UK and Canadian companies that have a subsidiary in the US and Australian, I'm sure, as well, and vice versa. There's, BA, I think, is the largest prime contractor in Australia now, not a U.S. company.
Well, they take turns.
They take turns, but yet BA is very big here. So the business is already happening. So, to the degree that we can enable further cooperation, I think is a good thing.
I want to follow up on, because I think several, in my remarks, and several of you talked about kind of the strategic basis. I think almost everyone did. And it stands out to me, at least, that all of the strategies make reference to the criticality of the partners working together. Obviously, Secretary Mattis is, not only does the strategy state it, but he stated it very eloquently in his remarks, which he unfortunately didn't deliver here when he rolled out the strategy, but nonetheless, they were great remarks. And I think each of you referenced it in some way. It's obviously critical to all the partners. And I think it relates to the point about senior leadership that I neglected to make, so thank you, Ghislaine, for bringing it up, because it seems to me when the senior leaders believe that an activity, something that they're being asked to spend their precious time on, relates to their top strategic priorities, it's going to, the odds of them actually giving you that time is much greater. When we dive down a little bit on this question with our OTA workshop, one of the striking things was that I think there's a lot of commonality on the technology areas that the governments see and also that industry in the different countries see. So as an example, I think Undersecretary Mike Griffin has just taken office as the new Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, really foot-stomped hypersonics. And one of the things we learned in our workshop is that hypersonics is an area that the US and Australia have actually been working on together for some time. Another topic that comes up a lot is a very popular topic here as elsewhere is artificial intelligence, and in a related, somewhat related area, quantum computing, and that's an area where the US and the UK have worked together closely. Cybersecurity is an area that the US and Canada have worked very closely on for a long time. So is there a difference? I mean, do we really have common areas when it comes to technology? Is there something that you say, well, this stands out, that this is something that's really critical to our armed forces, but it looks like our partner nations aren't quite as interested? Or are we really looking at the same sets of technologies that are the key things that our NTIB integration might be helping us to pursue that would get the Mike Griffins of the world, Secretary Mattis, the top leaders of the various departments and militaries around the world working together? Is it the same set, or are there significant differences in the technologies that industries and governments are pursuing?
Well, sure. I'll give a crack at that. So, Australia's, by comparison to the US, is small. So it's not possible to compete on the whole breadth of technological development. So our approach has always been to find niche contributions that we can make that will be valued because there's a gap or a weakness or a deficiency with our partner in that particular niche area. And that's historically been the way that we've been able to make a contribution, and that's you'll read about that in the
Outstanding.
Go on.
I think they're perfectly aligned, and even if sometimes we because some of us are smaller, we wouldn't necessarily have the same use of the same emerging technologies and everything. We still have the same common objective of making sure those technologies don't fall into the hands of our adversaries. So that's kind of another side of that coin. So we work together, the four countries on that aspect of the question too.
Well, I'd add really just saying you pick up on the fact there's a lot of bilateral collaboration in particular technologies, but there's multilateral collaboration as well. So if you take the Technical Cooperation Programme, although that's a Five Eyes, so that includes New Zealand as well, but it's a long-standing relationship which has seen a huge amount of collaboration on all sorts of technologies, and it prioritises those areas that are important to all of the nations. But even if you're working in a specific technology area, as you look into the detail of it, there are niche contributions that any one nation can make. So if you look at the way the TTCP program works, not every nation is involved in every aspect of it, but each nation can bring some unique aspect to that collaborative research work. So there is a huge amount of collaboration that goes on. I think the challenge is that's all about research and engineering. How can we best facilitate the rapid translation of these technologies into capability? And I think that's a challenge we all face as well in terms of the agility of our acquisition systems to try and deliver best possible capability in a timely manner.
Sure.
And that's where perhaps the NTIB can really help.
Let me talk a little bit about small and medium enterprises. That was something I didn't mention in my opening, but it is featured in the report. We had a fair amount of discussion on that actually at another workshop, a related workshop that a colleague of mine hosted on allied interoperability. And it was also a prominent factor in our Canada study. And what's actually interesting is if you look at the industrial base from the perspective of being a small and medium enterprise, then I think the industrial bases, there's obviously some difference of scale, but there's a lot of common issues across the industrial base, maybe more so than if you look at industry top down, although we do find that those top US firms are there and present in all our NTIB partner nations. But a lot of the struggles of a small business trying to be an active participant in the defense supply chain in the US, maybe not that different from those in Australia, those in the UK, those in Canada. And is that an opportunity? Is that because of, I think, a lot of the commonality of interest, or it can also be, as we point out in our report, possibly an issue. US small business policies only consider a small business if it's located in the US for purposes of most the small business preference issues. We didn't necessarily suggest any radical change to that approach because we don't think that would probably be successful in the US government. But do you see opportunities, particularly at the SME level, particularly for NTIB integration?
Well, I mean, we don't see it as an opportunity, we see it as a necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And because so much of our industrial base is small to medium enterprises. And one measure that we've taken in the last 18 months is to pull together all the support that was available to our SMEs and funnel it through a single clearinghouse, so the Centre for Defence Industry Capability. And so this centre provides coaching and services, mentoring services, helps small companies understand the defence market so they can have and the Pathfinder that we're pursuing under the NTIB is led out of that centre for this exact purpose of helping small companies comply with the US DFARS, which can be a challenge.
I don't know. Sorry, Simon, go ahead.
I mean, whilst the UK defence industry might consist of some larger companies, I think it's really important to focus on SMEs because quite often the SMEs are the people who have the really bright ideas and the really niche capabilities that you want to be able to tap into. So even if our industrial landscape might look different, I still think, yes, it's vitally important that we think about how we can facilitate SMEs doing business, or ways in which we can facilitate the ability to tap into the brilliant ideas in some of these small medium enterprises.
No, I would concur with that 100%. I mean, in the industrial base, we work very closely with the prime contractors, but we also recognize the importance, and we work closely with the small and medium-sized enterprises because that's where a lot of the innovation comes from. That's where a lot of, frankly, the challenges in the supply base can be manifested. So I think NTIB is a great vehicle to further kind of transparency in that area, and I think the idea of the national security and the innovation base that Eric talked about when he was here last and was outlined in the NSS and National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy kind of underscores that, is that yes, we work very closely with our traditional kind of defense partners, but we need to also kind of broaden that aperture a bit and work with small and medium-sized enterprises that are not necessarily in the defense space. A lot of them are, but some of them aren't. And so and some of those companies are in NTIB partner countries. So that's a great, it is a good thing to keep doing.
So in Canada, small and medium companies that want to compete directly on DoD contracts are really lucky because we have the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which is a kind of government-to-government contract agency, and essentially they're the sole contractor for every contract over the simplified acquisition threshold, so which is essentially every contract. So the difficulty of attracting new vendors for it doesn't really apply to Canada, because they can deal with an agency that has over 60 years of experience doing DoD contracts. So that's very good for us. And also on that, because you're part of the NTIB if you sell to the DoD essentially, and so if you're a commercial company, not a defense company, then you would still use the CCC, and so there's not that initial it's very intimidating to try to deal with the DoD. Also, the Canadian defense industry is such that most of the companies, their defense products often is less than 50% of their sales, right? So we don't really have defense and the rest in Canada. There's a lot of, often they're the same people, so that's also considering what we're trying to do to have more non-traditional vendors. Sometimes in Canada they're the same and they're already experienced dealing with the DoDs.
Just one additional thought, if the NTIB was to evolve and include new ideas of different programs. One program we've had some success with is the Global Supply Chain Program, where the primes that are in Australia, which are generally US primes, we give them a financial incentive to find opportunities in their global operations, not necessarily Australian programs, for competitive Australian companies that have some capability, some niche capability that's better than what they can find elsewhere, or they do it on a better price. And so the primes benefit, the companies benefit, and so it's a great model and for us, and so it could be an idea for broader application.
Well, I think everything that our partners can feed us that help us better access the commercial technology, non-traditional partners, where it's all to the good, and hopefully vice versa. I have one last question from my list, and then I'll turn to audience questions. But I just want to touch on the issue of how do we measure success in NTIB integration, and is there a finish line that we're heading towards, or a point at which we could report back to the Congress and say, got it, we've done what you asked? So just your thoughts on that. And anyone who wants to volunteer for it. Simon is my star. He's ready to jump in.
I mean, it's easier to talk about whether there's a finish line, because I'm not sure that there is a definable finish line. I think there's a goal or an aspiration that you might aim to achieve, but these things take a long time, as we've talked about, so it's an incremental approach. The nature of our industrial base will probably evolve over that time as well, and the threats and the technologies evolve. So it's probably one of these things you just continually have to work on, I would have thought. But if you have a common vision, and Jerry mentioned the fact that the principles for this NTIB work have just signed a statement of principles, which sets out that sort of vision of what we're trying to achieve. And while with a common vision like that, there's no reason why you can't keep that sort of iterative process going. How you measure it, I think, is challenging. I don't suppose there's any direct measures of integration of the technology base, but there may be some sort of indicators that you could use, and certainly you can engage with industry to get their sort of feedback on whether we feel we're moving in a positive direction, at least, I think.
So I think there's no finish line. So the Canadian experience shows that 7 years in, we're like this disruptive force of quadrilateral cooperation, and we go someplace else. There's no finish line. I don't think so. And more importantly, I think we're still kind of defining, what the starting line is, and actually, like, what sport we're playing, and right, how's the track going to look like, and everything. So I don't think we're at a finish line at all. And I'm sure in terms of measuring success, you're gonna have, you and your colleagues are gonna have ideas, and you're gonna pitch
Sounds like
these
a
to
great
us.
report, doesn't it?
Seems like the next report.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sentiments are fine. The only way to measure success is in having the best capability given to our deployed forces, and that's how we measure it.
Yeah, I would concur. I mean, success is not the outcome. Is well, not the the final product, but it's the journey, right? I don't know, kind of the aphorism there, but I think the fact we're doing this, we're doing practical cooperation around a set of important issues that are for each of our countries is, I think, part of the success of the initiative in and of itself.
All right. Well, this time I want to open it up to audience questions. And we have some folks with mics who can bring them around. If you have a question, raise your hand. And when the mic comes, you can introduce yourself and ask a brief question. We'll see who on the panel wants to engage on it.
Thank you. I was waiting for the simple questions to be answered first, because I actually came, my name is John King, I'm a retired civilian budget guy from the Pentagon, mainly for the Navy, but for OSD Comptroller also. I used to handle R&D, procurement accounts, construction, housing. I've been through all 5 BRAC rounds. I did the war budgets for a number of years. And since I'm a taxpayer, I also volunteered on the Simpson-Bowles Deficit Commission and wrote some of the recommendations to take away some of that money. But my challenge is this to the defense industrial base. It's like you're in a wait mode, and although you're getting pretty integrated, the idea is for how do you to play more effectively. So that's part of the storytelling that you need to get out there. When I get to see the report later today, I'm going to read it with much enthusiasm. But the American public, in our case, doesn't get the story about why defense industry is so integral, which is why for an old defense news article I wrote on doing BRAC right, we should include the defense industrial base as part of that assessment. But from a mechanical position, having run, say, the Navy's weapons budget for 5 years, when we got involved in the Iraq wars and stuff like that, my concern was the number of munitions we used to have. So, and one of the more recent examples of that is when we looked at the air operations in Libya. If I remember the story right, I think it was the British and the Italians that ran out of air-launchable munitions pretty quickly. And while I believe the Americans helped resupply that stock, the question to me was, if some of our allies didn't have enough munitions to take on Libya, what were they going to do with the Russians? So my question coming out of the weapons world was always, how do we get industry to accelerate the inventory? And so here's a couple things for leveraging coming from a budgeteer. If you're looking to figure out how to have industry participate, why don't we propose a couple of things for the 2019 NDAA? One of which is take the other transactions authority and extend it from just R&D into procurement. That way we could bring innovative kind of contracting strategies to the table, one of which could be leveraging. DoD industry is always waiting for the order, but being a budgeteer, there's a way we could get ahead of that curve too. If I look at procurement exhibits that extend out for 5 or more years, we have a mechanism where we like to, on occasion, do multi-year procurements. If I was a Wall Street financier and I saw a 5-year profile or more, and I saw the promise of 5 to 10% savings on multi-year contracts, I wouldn't wait for the government to publish one. I'd simply go talk to that company and do it for them. And I would pocket the difference.
Let me let the panel jump in on some of this. I think there was actually maybe more than one question there, but...
Well, the big question is, why not do something with extending OTA authority to procurement?
Okay.
And then the other part that I would add after that is there's a bias against leasing, and if you get rid of the 75% capital lease, there's a reason for that, and that's with cheap money at averaging about 2%, all you have to do is save 13% a year, and the lease is equal to the procurement. So if the company could produce something on a lease, at the end of the 5 years, they just turn it over to the Defense Department.
So we did, as part of, you'll be excited when you open the study, I hope, because we did look at other transaction authority agreements and ways that you could potentially use that. Roger, I don't know if you want to jump in on that. I know that was
I mean, the report has the background, but I just simply note the debate that's underway at the moment with respect to the JEDI contract out of CI Group. And that's an articulation from somehow a prototype contract to a big acquisition contract. I went to the industry day a few days ago to learn more about it, and so that's exploring the art of the possible with OTAs.
Yeah, there is. I should hasten because I personally was corrected on this on Twitter earlier that my understanding that JEDI is actually, they're talking about a FAR Part 12 contract at this point, but there have been OTA contracts for cloud that the department has done.
Yes, it is FAR Part 12 contract.
And one of the findings in the study we looked at, again, I mentioned there have historically been, I think we found 2 OTAs that were international in nature. But when you look at a lot of the vast number of OTAs that are out there, in many cases, there's a lot of consortia OTAs involved. And the consortia, by and large, have been limited to US companies. So unless at the top level, the OTA was specifically engineered as a cooperative effort between 2 nations in most cases, the ones that we're aware of, then the presumption is it's a US-only instrument. And our recommendation on the report is that that be revisited and that we might be a good idea to encourage OTA consortia to be international in nature to the extent that fits with the work that they're pursuing, and potentially that the NTIB look at whether a quadrilateral style OTA arrangement for specific purposes where that would be relevant could be useful. I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to jump in on OTA specifically.
The only thing I would say is, the Undersecretary Lord has said numerous times is that, Congress has given a lot of authority to the department to use commercial items more, to use other contracting vehicles. That we frankly have to work through a lot of those and kind of implement those more effectively. So and that's part of one of the big efforts of the 3 pillars for the priorities for the Secretary on business reform. So there's a lot of attention going on to using existing authorities before adding new ones, and that's a big focus for the deputy and for a lot of the acquisition workforce in the department.
There was a thread in his question, too, about telling the story of the industrial base. That was kind of where you started. And I know there's not a lot maybe that you can tell us, Jerry, but you've been looking at this. You've been looking at the story of the industrial base. Where are the possible gaps and weaknesses? I think there's been some areas of concern already identified. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I think Eric talked about it last time he was here, that the President signed an executive order in July of last year to do a comprehensive review of the manufacturing and defense industrial base of the United States. That is a whole of government effort. The department is leading that, but we're working very closely with the Department of Commerce, the Executive Office of the President, Homeland Security, Department of Labor, Department of Energy in that effort, and we are scheduled to deliver to the President by April 17th a set of recommendations on policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations to address some of the findings identified in our analysis. So that's what we're in the process of putting together right now.
You don't want to jump in on munitions specifically?
Munitions, I mean, it's well documented, some of the challenges, of maintaining the supply rates of those with given demands, and there's been a lot of attention, in the department on that, and so that's an important area in the industrial base, and there's been a lot of focus on, building the resilience of the industrial base in that area. So yeah, it's a big focus area.
Tom Davis. I'm the Defense Industry Chair at Forrestal Defense Industry Chair at Defense Acquisition University, former corporate VP for General Dynamics, fully recovered defense budget officer. Well, okay, Andrew, maybe partially recovered. Andrew had a report out in December that I found quite interesting about the American industrial base, and in it there was one sentence really caught my eye about the study showed that at least in the database that had been used, some 17,000 American companies had exited the database, meaning not getting a check from the U.S. government for something. It was left open as to whether or not that meant 17,000 American companies had exited the defense business. It's quite obvious over the last several years that the American defense industrial base has shifted from many large and mid-sized companies to only a handful of large companies and a large number of suppliers. It's basically a supplier base right now. I think all of you mentioned that in your countries, your industrial base, your indigenous industrial base is basically small companies. I think one of you said only a fraction of their income comes from the defense side of what they do. I'd just be curious to see if any of you had noticed or if your governments had noticed any change in the number of participants that you're having in your defense industrial base, either ones that are fully involved in it or only partially involved in it.
I'll just say, I think from a UK perspective, whilst there are a lot of small, medium enterprises in our defence industrial base, we're probably more aligned to the US side than Australia. Australia is predominantly small, medium enterprises, but we still have large industrial primes, either UK indigenous primes or a lot of our business in terms of defence actually is procuring through the subsidiaries of US primes in the UK. So the big sort of defence prime contractors that you will see in the US, you will also see in the UK and feature very heavily in the contracting that we undertake. I think I haven't got the figures, but I suspect that there is a similar sort of rationalisation has taken place over the years in terms of defence industry, with some of the smaller companies being taken over by some of the larger prime companies in the country, but I don't have the figures specifically for the numbers of companies that are engaged in contracting. That's information I'd have to look up.
I can.
Yeah. So all the defence primes that you would be familiar with here are present in Australia. So like our biggest contractors are BAE Australia, Lockheed Martin Australia, Northrop Grumman Australia, and so on. So they, as I mentioned, they employ about half of the workforce, but the other half of the workforce is employed by this large band of small to medium enterprises. There's a handful of intermediate companies, but not many. So some of the policy measures that I talked about, we're trying to encourage the companies to do more defence work. It is very common for these SMEs to only do a bit of work with defence, just because if the work does fluctuate with the programs. So they need to stay in business, and so there's very few SMEs that just wholly rely on defence work. I mean, there's prominent examples of ones that do, like CEA Technologies, which produces a phased array radar, which is our main sensor on our frigate, and it's sort of boutique military capability. And,
so I guess this is the Canadian version. I didn't want anyone to think that Canada only had SMEs in that space. Of course we similarly, and I'll probably get in trouble for using maybe last year's numbers, but I think five or six of our largest 10 or 11 defense companies are subsidiaries of U.S. companies. They represent, by volume, most of the majority of sales, and when it comes to exports, and even a larger share. And I guess that that's not surprising, is because they have the capacity to do that. And I also don't have Canadian numbers on number of participants, but I'd be happy to follow up after this.
One of the things I would say on that study is sort of one of the challenges we have in the industrial base is identification of all the participants. because a lot of there are multiple tiers down 5, 6, 7 tiers in the industrial base. And we contract through the Department of Defense contracts through the prime contractor. So, and that's the measure you have. So the 17,000 less companies doesn't mean 17,000 less companies are in the base. It just means they're not prime contractors, right? I'm sure that your report caveated that. So, so it is hard, to sometimes measure that. But we see a lot of new entrants coming in, to the base through different areas, through public-private partnerships such as these Manufacturing USA Institutes that look at commercial areas that have commercial and defense applicability, excuse me. Areas like additive manufacturing, digital manufacturing, flexible electronics. So, but it can be hard to measure if your only measure is looking at prime contractors.
I want to make sure I get gentleman back here who's been waiting. And then, Marcus, I think we can fit you in as the last one.
Yeah. Hi, I know you guys. I suppose any old guy like me is basically a consultant, but I did spend 16 years as VP of the Aerospace Industries Association. I know Jerry long enough. I won't embarrass you by asking about slapping major tariffs to protect the industrial base on 3 countries that are by law part of the defense industrial base. That's another issue altogether. But two bills have been introduced, and the hearings have been held on one, not the other. One would expand CFIUS to something called FIRMA. The other would create a permanent EAR. They're both there partly because of staff and committee jurisdiction issues. They both have an identical passage which says, an interagency group shall identify new and emerging technologies which will become important and need to be controlled, essentially, which is a real problem for what you've just been discussing in terms of if I'm a small or medium-sized company, do I want to tell the government I exist or not, given that 80% of my market would be civil? And putting offices in Boston or Silicon Valley may not be helpful if these guys, anyway, I just wonder if any of you guys have been asked to testify, have talked to Hill staffers, because something's going to happen, partly because, again, Foreign Affairs Committee and Banking Committee each want jurisdiction.
I can talk to the FIRMA legislation, which is on CFIUS reform. The Secretary Mattis has sent a letter in strong support, I think, to the Senator Cornyn, who is the principal author, and Senator Feinstein, and the other co-sponsors of the legislation. The department supports the broad thrust of the effort, and we're a member of the CFIUS committee, which is chaired by the Department of Treasury. And the last time CFIUS was looked at was in 2007, so it's been 10 years. The challenges facing our national security are different. That was focused more around critical infrastructure protection. Now we have different set of challenges facing us, and there is that balance of how do you in some of these advanced technology areas, how do you maintain, incentivize industry to maintain those capabilities here, but not stifle kind of innovation. So, and that's one of the things that FIRMA is trying to get at. I'll leave it to the legislature to figure the best way to do that. I can't comment on the export control efforts. That's not an area that I've been focusing on.
I'll just add a comment with regards to investment security. We don't have CFIUS legislation, but we have similar sort of legislation in place. But I think the CFIUS reforms are responding to a changing environment with which we're working, and we all face that sort of changing environment. And the UK has similarly put out recently issued a green paper, which is part of our consultative process for new legislation, looking at how we might adapt or change our sort of investment security regulations to respond to similar sort of problems. And I think we in the context of we're all trying to work as close partners here, I think we all recognise the need to do that, but also to try and, if you want, manage some of the unwanted sort of investment that we are concerned about, but also still facilitate that cross-border investment between partners, which actually is quite important in terms of having a healthy industrial base. So there's a balance which is difficult to strike.
Yeah, we've got the Foreign Investment Review Board that works very closely with the US, and we support the firmer improvements.
All right, Marcus, you get the last question.
Hi, Marcus Weisgerber with Defense One. Dr. McGinn, I do want to ask you the tariff question, but I'll try to ask it a different way. Does the department have a good handle on how much foreign aluminum and steel is actually part of U.S. weaponry? And if not, is there an effort underway to study that? And for the rest of the panel, how would you see these tariffs impacting defense industrial cooperation between your countries and the United States? Thank you.
Great. We look at materials and metals in our industrial base analysis all the time to understand, maintain that we have enough to support our major programs and systems. So we do that analysis all the time. That's usually led by DLA, Department of Defense Logistics Agency. They have a strategic materials group that kind of does that analysis. We support and work with them. As far as the specific question, the Section 232 of the 1962 trade law requires DoD to provide input to the Department of Commerce's investigation, and we provided that input on DoD demand as required by law. And but I don't have anything else additional to say publicly at this time.
So the UK government has been clear, in its view that tariffs are not the right way to address the sort of global problem of overcapacity, which we believe requires a multilateral solution. There's not much more I can say. The EU will work close. The UK will work close with the EU partners. We're still a member of the EU at the moment. To consider the scope for exemption outlined in the announcement and continue to work with all sectors involved in this decision to robustly support our industries and demonstrate the importance of high quality products for US industries and security. Figures, I don't have any figures that I can give you.
Well, it's a tricky one. I don't want to get too far out of my lane, but I just would note that our Prime Minister has left no doubt as to what his opinion is in recent days. And free trade is central to our philosophy, so we don't impose any tariffs on incoming US exports.
Hey, I'll pass on this one and make a lot of friends at home.
I'll respect that. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. The report is on the website, or shall be very soon on the website. There is a limited number of hard copies available. We hope you'll get it. We hope you'll read it. We would love to field any questions you would have on it. And I really want to thank the panel for an interesting discussion and for the work that you're doing on NTIB integration. Please join me in giving them a round of thanks.
Good. Thank you.